It's not a question really defending or supporting it or whatever the case may be. It really is a question of understanding that this exists. Jeff was quite clear about the fact that it's now something that banks have to be continuing to work with, and so it's a realization that that's the new reality in terms of where we live. So how do we make it real? What do we need to be able to do? The FCA obviously has a lot of rulemaking and enforcement power, and so it's important to understand that we need to take some of their input seriously in terms of the organization. But at the same time, I think we need to realize that we need to do this as efficiently, as effectively as possible, because ultimately we do want to serve our customers. We do want to make sure that sugar gets from point A to point B, and that your Aunt Annie would get the sugar in her tea, and she wants the sugar, and I want my Kit Kat. So you want to be able to make sure that those kind of transactions actually do happen. So just very quickly, just highlighting the facets of trade-related documents and processes that should be checked for red flags. All banks have some kind of red flag procedure in place. Now, what does that mean? Essentially is identifying any potential suspicious activity that can be that can occur in a transaction. You've got customer red flags in terms of the nature of the trade. Is that consistent with what the customer is doing? Jeff had talked about KYCC, knowing your customer's customer. So while that may be a little bit challenging occasionally, it's important to at least have that first step, to know your customer, right? To be able to understand from your customer and understand what the nature of that organization is. Can you get away entirely without any risk, even for established customer? No, of course not. I mean, there's going to be instances, transactions, that Qingdao example that we talked about in China, where you thought there was a reputable warehouse, a bonded warehouse, but the reality was that it got away with millions, and it's something that has to be recognized. You have to be able to obviously minimize the risk. So customer red flags are certainly important. Documentary red flags, UCP 600, I think is very clear on some of the transactions there, looking at the terminology and so forth. Transaction red flags, could there be tax avoidance or money laundering, the example I showed earlier. Pretty much, for the first set I showed was really about money laundering. The second one probably about tax avoidance. There's many examples. I remember when I was a kid, I grew up in Singapore and Hong Kong, and as a kid I worked in a trade house. And a lot of times, I'm not going to name names, but a lot of times what we would do is we'd undervalue the exports that we had for the primary purpose of customs avoidance. I mean, in terms of duty and so forth, you want to be able to reduce that so you pay less penalties or duties on the shipments. That still happens. Your customers still do that. I'm sure you recognize that. There are many examples of that happening as well. Now, when you look at sanctions red flags, that's obviously something that in the FCA report had talked about being quite well established. Most banks have been able to establish that. But when you start looking at shipment red flags, when you start looking at potential dual-use goods items, that's something that they pointed out as being obviously inherently riskier.